Hi. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 639th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Ian Cheng and Charlotte Kent. We're thrilled to welcome poet Dot Devota here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we are speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Ian Cheng's work explores the nature of mutation and the capacity of humans to relate to change. Drawing on principles of video game design, improvisation, and cognitive science, Cheng has produced a series of simulations exploring an agent's capacity to deal with an ever-evolving environment. Most recently, he's developed Bob, Bag of Beliefs, an AI creature whose personality, body, and life story evolve across exhibitions, what Cheng calls art with a nervous system. Assistant Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and academic journals and is an editor-at-large for The Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Ian, for joining us from Berlin, where you have your show right now, Life After Bob, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I have really been looking forward to this conversation. I've been thinking a lot about it. And if we could start the slideshow. As I was doing this, I came upon this cartoon. It's one of my favorites. And I sort of felt like not only did this summarize how I felt about thinking about all the different things I wanted to talk about, but in thinking about some of the work that you've also written, made me feel like maybe you are also someone who thinks about things all the time and a lot. And so even before we get started with like the particular project, it's so easy to fall into seriousness when we're thinking really deeply about things. And yet you also talk a lot about play. So I was just wondering if you could just share, like, how do you keep yourself light? How do you keep the serious thinking that you're doing from becoming pedantic?
I mean, two things. Definitely, I'm a father of two now. So when I became a father of one, it was already, I call it a redemptive moment, because what comes out when we learn being a dad is you start to play back all these, they're not even memories because they're not episodic, but they're just like little gestures or things that your parents told you and then you do. All this stuff comes flooding back because now you have to activate that part of you for your own kid. And so with my daughter Eden, when she was first born, I felt all these moments from my own childhood return, not just once, but every day, with every little gesture or behavior that she was doing. And of course, she's growing all the time. So it's new stuff all the time, but it's also a rerun back from when I was 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. And so I get to re-experience all that again. I thought it was all locked away, or I didn't even know it was locked away. I didn't even know it existed, and it's all still there. And then it's a moment where I get to renegotiate in a way, like what to keep and what to throw away. Like, oh, my mom, I hear my mom's voice again telling me instinctively to tell my daughter Eden to not climb the table and jump. But then the playful part of me is like saying, well, it's not that high and she'll figure it out. So I get to like kind of renegotiate that. Another part of me is that I can't get out of my seat or out of the bed in the morning unless there's like not a playful reason to get out, but like a childlike reason to get out. I don't think you can make art without a childlike curiosity and a childlike kind of energy. I call it a demonic energy, but not like an evil way, but like a kind of possessed way. I kind of need that to make anything. I can be obligated to do things, but only so much. You can't really obligate yourself to make art. I'm not saying art is easy. It's like super hard. And there's lots of trying moments, but I have to invent reasons in those moments to get that child in me to like give me demonic energy. It's rocket fuel to then actually do a thing. And so I think I have to be playful as a necessity to being an artist.
It's interesting they use the word demonic. I think we're going to probably come back to the whole notion of demons. But yeah, I mean, so I think it's important, this notion of play. And come up when we're looking at Life After Bob. Maybe we could go to one of the installation shots. We have one from the shed. Unfortunately, I can't be there in Berlin to see the show. So otherwise I would have taken a snap myself. Even before, just to sort of provide a little bit of background, because I'm just not sure how much everyone knows about each of the different works. Bob, originally, this bag of beliefs, but first Bob, is this like animal-like agent that deals with a changing environment. And you talked about designing this from the ideas of Richard Evans, who's an AI scientist at DeepMind, and from the psychologist Carl Jung, which are two really interesting sort of thinkers to bring together for this project. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those two in particular became sort of major forces for this Bob.
Yeah, so Bob it's an AI creature. It plays out in a kind of virtual environment, but the dream of making Bob, the kind of initial idea was, how can I make an artwork whose compositional space was a life, life has a birth, it has a death, it has all this stuff in between. And how do you create all that stuff in between? That's like the meat of an artwork, or the meat of a compositional space. And so, of course, this leads to a question of trying to produce an AI model that can sufficiently produce enough adaptive learned behavior over the course of a lifetime, and to do that credibly. And, for a long time at the beginning of the production of Bob, this is around 2017, 2018, we were trying to make this animal-like creature all within one unified AI model. And it took the insight of Carl Jung, who said, people you're not a coherent person, you're a composition of often competing sub-personalities. There's like multiple people inside you. And that sounds quite scary and schizophrenic, but as soon as you start thinking about those moments where you're, like really hangry because you haven't eaten like breakfast or lunch, you could say a part of you sort of takes over, and the only thing you see in your perceptive field is food, not food, and like obstacles to food. And this really, in a way, is thermodynamic. Everything that's not food or an obstacle to food is just irrelevant. So actually, you can be quite focused, in a demonic way. And then once that hunger demon is satisfied, maybe you have a thirst demon that needs to be satisfied. Maybe you have a play demon that has to be satisfied. Maybe you have a sleep demon that has to be satisfied. So we've modeled Bob through this insight by Carl Jung that Bob is essentially 12 different sub-personalities that are constantly competing, sometimes for consensus and sometimes just the strongest, most urgent one kind of takes over. We call it the Congress of Demons, almost like a Congress where someone like grabs the mic and then that demon takes control of Bob's body. And what you see from the outside, looking at this virtual creature, is a certain motivated behavior. But then quite quickly, as we do in real life, it can maybe, if an opportunity emerges, like a little bucket of water appears, Bob can switch to the thirst demon because there's opportunity for that to be satisfied quite quickly. So it's like it grabs the mic in Bob's body and goes for that. But then let's say it's like not water, it's like a bucket of ice, and they can't drink that. Maybe there's a fight and flight demon. Maybe it perceives this bucket of water as like threatening because it's frozen, it's hard, and try to bite it and hurt its teeth. So maybe it'll flick it away. And on the outside, it just looks like this creature went up to a bucket of water, tried to investigate it, tried to drink it, it was frozen, and then flicked it away. But that's actually the different demons kind of taking over successively as new opportunities emerge and as opportunities close off in its environment. So that's one half of the model. The other half was inspired by Richard Evans, who is an AI scientist, at DeepMind. And he was inspired by Immanuel Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, which is basically a playbook of how the mind is architected. But of course, in Kant's lifetime, there were no computers to model this out and see if he was right. Richard Evans took this upon himself because it seemed quite reasonable what Kant was proposing. And just to be very brief about it, he basically developed a theory of experience as what you experience as life internally is an earned experience. It's not just a natural thing that comes to you, although it feels that way. It's earned, and what it's earning is the unification of a new sensory environment. Maybe it's one new object in your environment, or you're dropped off in a new city, and everything's new. It's the unification of the new sensory information with your current model of the world. And if you can unify that satisfying feeling, that's experience. If you can't unify it, well, either feels like you're on drugs or you're crazy. I don't know if you've ever been on psilocybin or LSD. Everything's overly relevant and resistant to unification. And on one hand, you might think this is a very like fun and pleasurable experience. It's probably what little children feel at the beginning of their life, before things get kind of put into different buckets of beliefs and categories. It's probably what animals often maybe experience at early parts of their life. But once you can unify that, then you can reapply this new model of the world to yet even further experiences. And you're always slightly wrong. Like I went to Korea in March to open a show there, and I applied all my kind of beliefs about how a city works to being in Seoul, Korea. And of course I was like maybe 80% right, but I was like 20% really wrong. And I had to readjust those, rechange my beliefs. Blah, blah, blah. Richard Evans developed a computational system that essentially produces little rules or beliefs that get kind of nested in each other that help the computational system perceive a new situation and make inferences about it that are quite accurate. And when they're wrong, it readjusts and updates itself. And you hear all these stories of like AI models that need hundreds of thousands of images of dogs to recognize a dog. The computational system that Richard Evans developed, he calls it the A perception engine. You need one or two examples. And that struck me as really truthful. I tell my daughter, this is our dog. We have a little quirky dog. She just sees what you can do with the dog. Like meaning literally means the action you can do with a thing for a child. And I think that's actually true of what meaning actually is. It's like how you can act upon something. She thinks the dog is a pet because it's literally petable. I mean, I think maybe that's why they call them a pet. It's a furry thing that you can pet. And then when she first saw a cat, there's this like really fat stray cat in our neighborhood. We call it Fat Tabby. It looks like Garfield, just eats all the food in Chinatown on the streets. Really feral. All the dogs are scared of it. She's like, oh, like she's like dog, and she went up to it, like super mean cat, and she got super scared. And now she understands intuitively. She has a new rule for cat. It's like a petable thing, but it doesn't want to be pet, and it's like super scary. That's her definition of cat, and it's like good enough, right? I mean, one day maybe she becomes a connoisseur of cats and dogs, but that's for adults anyway. All you need for an AI or a small child is these very basic ways of navigating the world through successive rules that are good enough. It's always good enough. And I think this is thermodynamically true, and I think this is true of children and animals. And so this is a huge inspiration, along with Carl Jung, for how we constructed Bob's AI.
That story reminded me of my best friend from college took her son when he was very, very little to the Met here in New York. And one of the things was like, you can't touch, right? So they kept sort of saying like, you can't touch the art, no touch art. You can touch the bench, you can touch this wall over here. Like, you know, they were trying to show what you could touch, what you can't. No touch art, right? Kept happening. So at the end of the day, it's been really fun. They've had a great time and it's time to go. And they're standing outside on the steps and he doesn't want to go. He wants to like be able to keep hanging out in the city and doing all these fun things. And his father starts to go to pick him up, like, you know, pick him up and take him to the car the way parents do when it's like time to go and you need to go. And he takes a step back and goes, I'm art. Right? He had totally grasped what art was like a no touching thing. And so he decided he would claim that concept. And it's always like to this idea of the bag of beliefs. Like, it's just so interesting when you see that happen. I'm sort of pulled in so many different directions because I want to sort of, you know, push on some of the stuff with Kant and like other thinkers who've come after that. But I guess, you know, because I want to talk about, you know, from the shift from Bob and this sort of bag of beliefs into then making this film, Life After Bob, which you described actually in a Brooklyn Rail interview with Osman as where you could hang out with a living mythological archetype. Right? And there was this opportunity to like hang out. But when you make the film, it feels more like more situated, right? Like now it's like less of that kind of hanging out that happens with Bob. And now suddenly it's like, I'm getting this sort of contained experience. And so I was just wondering, like, what shifted for you from the making of Bob, where people get to have this kind of like own experience, to the making of the film that is a very different kind of offering?
Yeah. Well, two things. I think firstly, it came from this super stupid delusion that when my daughter was born, I thought, you know what, AI is like really hard. I'm really proud of Bob. You know, I think there's a future where like we're all gonna have like not only virtual pets, but obviously like, you know, virtual mirrors of ourselves, all like AI generated, all AI powered, blah, blah, blah. There's like, oh, I can keep working on Bob. I thought, oh, I'm going to do something easy for myself now that I have a newborn. I'm going to make an animated movie. Of course, like super easy, no problem, like the easiest thing in the world, right? I thought it was easy because I assumed that all the infrastructure and the expertise to make animated films pre-exist. There was no pre-existing infrastructure or expertise to make Bob. I mean, with the exception of Richard Evans, but that was just one part of the puzzle. And that was the main artistic and technical challenge of Bob. I thought, oh, with Life After Bob, I have this idea for script. There's so many people that can help me, like piece of cake. As soon as I started the ball rolling, I'm like, well, I can't just make an animated film. Like, oh, like that's, who cares? That's so boring. Like I have to make it in Unity, which is this video game engine, which I've made most of my work, including Bob. So the film has to play live, and the background characters have to like maybe improvise their scenes and change every time you watch it. And I have to work on it in terms of production process without the rigidity of traditional 3D animation, where you have to like do passes of animation and super expensive. You know, an episode of Rick and Morty costs like 28 minutes and it costs like 2.8 million. Tons of money. I'm going to do this in Unity where things can iterate fast. It's like software, movies like software now. So I had all these ideas about like how to remake, how to redo filmmaking for myself. And this turned into like a monstrous project, like way harder than anything I've ever done. But pain came from a really stupid, naive notion that I would pivot from making AI for like a year to doing storytelling, which was like a huge underestimation, let alone the writing. Like I have so much appreciation for screenwriters now. I see the magic that they really do in terms of condensing both legible archetypes and trying to shift an archetype just slightly so that you can get something new and nutritious and interesting, but just from one perspective, not from everything. And so I have all this appreciation for the filmmaking process now. It started from this naive notion that I could just like make a film as like an easy thing. And then the other side of that was I was very much inspired by thinking about the future of what an AI creature like Bob, the AI, could do, given like 50 years from now and lots of like R&D development. Could we live in a world where we had these AI entities that were essentially like life coaches or kind of inner like therapists that live with us in our head? I mean, that sounds nightmarish, I think, to a lot of people, but when you consider that we are multiple sub-personalities and often we're talking to ourselves in our head, like it's kind of comforting to have another voice that feels a little outside of you to give you some perspective. So I thought, oh, what if we had AI that could just be in your head? The only way to explore this notion is through narrative, through fiction. So I thought, oh, I really want to write about this. So that part came quite naturally. And then the last part I would say is I just became a dad and I was like super scared. Had all these anxieties about how am I going to balance like being an artist and being a dad? Like it's so hard. Who me? I mean, I was reading the Stephen King book on writing at the time, and he said he wrote The Shining under similar conditions. He said, what's the worst dad I can imagine myself being? Oh, it's the dad that like resents my child and my wife and now has writer's block and blames my child on my writer's block. Now that wasn't my problem, but I thought, oh, that's like a great way to write. You write from what's really scares you, even if the phobia is completely unfounded and totally ridiculous. You explore that, it quickly becomes quite universal and very primal inner, like it becomes dreamlike. And so I thought that was a huge inspiration for me for writing Life After Love. I thought, what's the worst kind of dad I could be in this kind of anxious state that I'm writing this in? And I thought, oh, it's the dad that conflates his work for his, in my case, the daughter. And if we were to do that in the case of Life After Bob, the first episode called The Chalice Study, the father called Dr. Wong embeds an AI called Bob inside his daughter Chalice at birth to kind of be a kind of co-parent and life coach for her. But of course, Chalice, as a 10-year-old growing up, we meet her at 10 years old as a a kid growing up with an AI constantly helping you, she abdicates all this responsibility to AI. So every conflict in her life, like a school, like a playground conflict with her parents, she just like lets Bob, you do it. And Bob acts through her and like does the perfect job of mediating for her. So she grows up at 10 years old without any kind of ability, without any kind of cognitive muscle. Like she's so super weak of mind because she hasn't faced any trials on her own. And meanwhile, her father falls in love with the Bob side of her, of course, because it's like the perfect child that this AI is now acting through her, and it's kind of synonymous with her at a certain point. And so the dad falls in love with the Bob side of Chalice, and the human side of Chalice, of course, becomes jealous and feels obsolete. So the confluence of all that stuff really became the reason to do Life After Bob. And honestly, once I had that many things rolling in my mind, I just I had to do it.
So it's kind of great to hear you say all that, because now I do get to go to this Hegel thing I wanted to bring up, because it feels like that was one of the interesting things about the difference between Bob and then Life After Bob. Like Bob is basically, I'm going to say himself, but like, Bob is by himself, right? Like, except that then you introduce these sort of, I can't remember the term, but you sort of refer to them as these like parental sort of, Bob yeah. So basically through the Bob Shrines, for the audience, for the audience who might not be familiar, you can sort of send things to Bob, you can include a message, and you can lie in the message. You can be like, this is delicious, and it's something totally foul. And then Bob learns like, oh, so that it alters the bag of beliefs that way. But one of the reasons, and then in Life After Bob, right, it's this totally like socially interactive thing. But the whole thing that sort of struck with me, and one of the reasons I've always like, believe me, I think Kant is totally brilliant, and I love Kant, and every once in a while I actually even enjoy reading Kant. But one of the things about his sort of model is that it's still this very isolated model. And one of the things that Hegel really brings up, which I think is so beautiful, is this kind of like the notion of the interpersonal, and that our sense of self really actually comes from the recognition of others, that we are conscious agents, right? That like our self arrives through being reflected from others. And obviously then psychology does a bunch of different things with that. But one of the things that sort of stuck with me around that is like, to what degree could Bob, if you take that notion, right? And I realized that wasn't like a part of your planning, but I was just thinking about it. Like, if you take that notion, that how can Bob recognize himself as Bob if there aren't agents with whom to interact, right? Others to recognize Bob as Bob. And so then when you did Life After Bob, it becomes this really interesting thing, because it's like Bob gets to be recognized, right? It's like,
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I remember coming across some study where like, I don't know, some perverse study where like they studied like people in total social deprivation, they just die sooner. They literally just die sooner, like especially infants and little kids, not just, oh, you need like the protection of mommy and daddy. It's like the lack of touch for an infant, like certain neural formations just don't even form, or kill certain neural pathways that really want to form, and they just don't form. And then that cascades into all these negative consequences to both physical health and mental health. People just die from lack of socialization. So yeah, sure. Bob, the original Bob, well, we programmed the ability for other Bobs to visit Bob. It technically exists within our code base. We just didn't pull the trigger on letting that happen yet. I mean, currently there are several editions of Bob off into the world and different institutions, and there is a latent ability for Bobs to visit other Bobs, but I haven't pulled the trigger on that yet, because I think there's a larger project here to socialize a whole a Cambrian explosion of virtual creatures and to have them together. That's definitely something I'm planning.
So I just kind of want to talk to you about that. That was really exciting to hear that, because this thing around, so much of what we talk about when we talk about AI and sentience and other creatures, right, is like this notion of autonomy. And, at least right now, it doesn't seem like Bob can conceive the mind of another, right?
Oh, absolutely. I would never claim that. Yeah, definitely not. No, Yeah, no, definitely not.
But one of the things about like the whole conversation that happens around some of the stuff about autonomy is, again, it seems super isolationist. And there's this historian, Lynn Hunt, who introduces the importance of empathy, and that actually dignity is constituted through both autonomy and empathy. And that it's, since dignity is such a sort of fundamental part of being a person. And I was thinking about that with the demons. So just to sort of go back a step, like with Bob, there's these, like when you were describing it, it's like the food demon, or the sleep demon, or like these sort of creatures, like the internal entities that sort of desire these different things. And I suddenly had this question, like, can you imagine an empathy demon?
Well, it's an interesting question because as we dug more and more into producing this particular AI model, which is based on these, part of it's based on this Kantian, Richard Evans inference stuff, and the other half is this Congress of Demons, this idea of multiple sub-personalities, each with a basic motivation. We always have to phrase it programmatically as a very actionable thing.
Sure.
And so it's interesting to think of empathy about what the action is. So like when to be a total cynic, when a person is empathetic, maybe the person that they're being empathetic to reminds them of their grandma. And so it's triggering a positive memory of that. Maybe, this is really cynical, being empathetic to someone triggers some like narcissistic idea that actually I'm a good person when I'm actually not, but I helped this person. I did this empathetic, I held the door open, or like I listened to someone's woes, and I've had that experience too. And then we relate on that. If maybe it's triggering some like narcissistic game where like I get Eric Berne, the psychologist, I like call it strokes. There's like all these social games where you get a stroke, and it could be very twisted, these games. And so just to talk about Bob for a second, we had to phrase each demon toward some motivation. It could be not nearly as cynical as that, like food is food. But if you had to program an empathy demon, one would have to then specify what that is satisfying in Bob, in this case, in the AI agent. And that led me and the team I worked with to all these quite cynical questions about both human behavior and animal behavior. That was very sobering. And in a way, the more cynical we got, the more realistic the behavior became.
So that's sort of interesting. The more cynical you got, the more realistic.
Cynical maybe is the wrong word. I guess I mean the idea that, for example, I use the ideas of empathy and altruism, that they emerged from just like a kind of universal goodness. It's often much more complicated than that, I think. And in fact, they probably satisfy multiple, both personal and social needs in order for someone to actually be motivated to produce an empathetic gesture. In fact, that is maybe the key unsolved, never to be solved problem of AI and maybe of human beings, is this idea of alignment. Like, how do you align different motivations, both in your immediate present, in your 5-minute future, in your 10-minute future, in the future for you and your partner, or you and your child, or you and your dog. And then you just circulate both the time and social interaction, the number of people you want to include in the alignment of your action. And how do you get that action to satisfy all of those, like your family, your friends, your community, you 5 years from now, you 10 years from now. If you can somehow find an action that satisfies all that, believe me, that is a meaningful action, and you will totally pursue it with your entire body and your might with full force, because it seems to align everything. And it seems like the perfect and most meaningful thing to do is to do that thing. And often I think we struggle with finding what to do because, oh, you like, I don't know, like dumb thing is like, oh, if I get this coffee now, then I'll be tired in the afternoon. Or if I eat this like carb right now, I'll like feel fat in the afternoon. If I eat this carb right now, I'll give me energy. You know, like you come in constantly shifting perspective about the alignment. It's always a problem. I think this alignment problem is probably empathy is probably an alignment problem too. Yeah, this is blah, blah, blah. This is something that we ran into in making Bob, like, oh, you could just telescope Bob's problems forever into the future and forever to multiple other Bobs or other entities. And you just get more and more cognitive dissonance that has to be resolved by Bob's mind.
Yeah.
I think this is a problem all of us face right now.
Totally. It's interesting though to think about. empathy and that type of relationality that you were talking about, and the way in which, like, part of if it's, you know, given this sort of seeming truth about the fact that if you don't have touch, if you don't have interaction, like, you are sicker, right? You're more prone to illness. There's neurodevelopment issues, all of these sort of impacts that come from not having contact. It's interesting. It made me think about, like, is empathy just kind of a way to keep people around you? Like, is it actually this kind of like growth and health mechanism or something? Anyway.
It might be that. It might also be, you know, when you say you love someone, you it's two things, right? You love someone means you want the best for them, but it also means you want the best for them in the kind of parental way, like, oh, I want to like shape your condition so you in your diminished way can succeed with all your flaws. And then you also admire them, right? Like, I admire my children. There's something in you, there's a spark, there's a divine spark in you that's like way greater than my stupid life. And like, I admire that, so shining, and I love you. And like, I love you means both of those things. I think empathy probably has multiple valences like that too.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it's almost impossible to define the word love, right? Like, it just can be so challenging. But you were talking about meaning making. And of course, I'm just, you know, it's sort of interesting this way the conversation is going. It's sort of almost tracking the way people have developed new notions of what it means to be a person over time. The existentialists, like, what they sort of contribute is the idea that what makes a person is their ability to be meaning makers. And so whether you agree with that or not, like, just is that something you think Bob could do?
It depends on what you mean by meaning. And I guess we had to figure that question out too. Like, what is meaningful to Bob at any given moment? Well, we asked it in a stupid way like that, like, in the given moment, let's make it really small. Like, what is meaningful to Bob right now? Well, Bob's hungry and Bob sees an apple across the room, then that apple means a lot because it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for a particular action that satisfies the current motivation. Therefore, it's meaningful. Now, let's say that same apple looks like a really fun toy to throw at a wall, and Bob knows it can splatter in a satisfying way. Well, that apple is doubly meaningful because it satisfies both its motivation for hunger and potentially, if it want to, its motivation for play. So now it's like double meaningful. And so Bob is like, you know, very attracted to this apple. And so, and then maybe the apple is potentially has a poisonous little worm in it, and that worm could kill Bob. Well, that negative possibility is even more meaningful because Bob doesn't want to die. And so I think meaning in the sense of this very basic like AI level is like, does something present an opportunity for action or multiple aligned actions? And if it does, it's meaningful. And it's so interesting to think of the world in terms of whether it's composed of objects or if it's composed of meaning. I think actually we think from a scientific point of view where you say, of course, the universe is there, it's material, it precedes our cognitive ability, blah, blah, blah. We live in a world of objects. But actually our complex neural structure makes it from our point of view that we're actually composed of, we see the world first as composed of like patterns and meaning, opportunities for action. And then later, like, oh, we could say that apple has an appleness to it. Because it averages out across multiple people, and we can do these scientific experiments and verify its existence, which on a material level is totally true, but I think the way we perceive the world is actually through meaning or lack of meaning in our given environment based on our motivation. That's why it's so tricky to define, because our motivations are constantly changing and they're different from each other and they're different from animals. But nonetheless, we know and feel that meaning does exist, right? Especially for sentient creatures. What is that? I think it's this pattern of opportunity for actions, or maybe the reframing of that opportunity too. There's a kind of a meta level for meaning. Then it's like super meaningful. If you encounter an object that reframes all your beliefs about that thing, then that's like even more meaningful.
So yeah, I guess
that's probably the only definition I could come to that sort of holds for AI, I think.
So, but that also leads me to want to ask, like, you've spent so much time with Bob, like obviously just having to design and develop it, and then with the film and everything, but has Bob changed your beliefs?
Well, there's one thing that we happened with Bob, which is that once we had this kind of this AI engine running, it could kind of produce these basic rules based on its sensory experience, has the motivations to act on them. Bob often painted itself in a belief corner. So like it would maybe encounter too many like negative green things early in its simulated life. And then now when you've introduced like a new green food, it just wouldn't touch it. It reminds me of my own kids, like, you know, thankfully they like avocado and broccoli, but there was a moment where they really didn't, because maybe I think they had like a bitter, like a, what do you call this, Brussels sprout once, and then my daughter was just like, no more green things. And it took a parental force to say like, try this damn guacamole, like just try it, like almost shoving it in her mouth. And she's like, oh my gosh, she loves guacamole now. And it took this parental force to rejig the belief. And I know everyone has, you know, whatever trouble with their parents, of course, but I realized that moment, like parental injunctions are the scaffolding for life. Like when you're stupid and young and have a lack of understanding and beliefs about the world, you actually need your parents to shake you up and force beliefs upon you in order to like even decalcify the first few prejudices and beliefs that you have about how the world works. And we had to do that with Bob. We had to make these shrines that you see above Bob in the artwork, that there's this iPhone app called the Bob Shrine app, where you can make offerings to Bob and attach, if you want to, parental captions. And of course, you can be like a malicious parent. You can like attach, like you give Bob an apple and say like, apples are like poisonous, never eat an apple again. And Bob is forced to listen to that. On the flip side, a lot of people have chosen to attach parental captions are quite healthy. Like there's an apple, like this is nutritious. And if you encounter a particular Bob is like afraid of red things for whatever life experiences they've had. It's when this shrine makes that parental caption, offers like a red apple with the parental caption, like, please eat this, you know, you'll love it. It's forced to try that. Then that's what we found gave Bob like actually a longer life. Like it actually didn't paint itself into a starved corner and starve to death. That was probably the main thing. It gave me an appreciation of parenting before I became a parent.
Interesting. It's sort of interesting to think about how these art projects, you know, it's so easy sometimes to think about how, you know, the artist creates the art, but like to remember the way in which the art also then through the interaction, through the act, like whatever form of art it is, I don't think it's like specific to simulation, right? But like in any form of art, it then also acts on you because it changes what you want to do next, or it changes how you think about something or your practice or whatever.
It's funny you say that. My wife is always saying to me, Ian, fucking hey, like, can you just do a simple project that doesn't have to change you this time? Because we could just like, you know, go on vacation more, or just like chill, like, take it down from 11 to 9. But I mean, I have a fundamental belief that the art I really like to see and to encounter, and the art I aspire to make, you know, has a kind of, I don't know the answer before I make it. Otherwise, it's not worth making. Like if I want to make propaganda, if I have like some like notion of what a thing means already, and then I go and make the art, I feel like it's essentially making propaganda, or it's making, I don't know, it's like singing to the choir. Like I don't want to make that kind of art. For me, like making art is a way to explore a question where you don't really can't articulate it any other way. So like that's why you have to make it into art, because it's trying to satisfy some answers that are maybe too complex or gray or too fraught at the moment to articulate in a more direct way. Like if I could just write a tweet about it or write a blog about it, like, well, I wouldn't have to make an art about it.
So what, I mean, I'm wondering when we would just shift for a moment to like the medium of the practice, right? I mean, you're using video game engines, you're using AI. Were those familiar to you? Were those, I mean, were those, no, so they were not.
Scary. They were scary to me. And that's what made it exciting for me. I thought there was a moment to be able to flex. It's almost like I start to see making art like athletically. You know, when you watch like a really great athlete, like they kind of stretch their ability just a little bit every game. I see, you know, the exhibitions that I do and the projects I take on, it's like I'm trying to stretch my ability a little. And it's always a little bit scary. Like when I first started Bob, I mean, I had a cognitive science academic understanding of AI, but I didn't have a practical engineering understanding. I definitely didn't know all this stuff about Carl Jung and Kant's ideas of how one's cognitive architecture works. And so scary to undertake that. When I started making the simulations in like 2012, 2013, I thought, oh, I gotta make this in a video game engine. What the hell do I know about video game engines? I mean, I was a decent programmer in college, but that was so long ago. This is a whole different world. And for me, part of that, the technical medium that you're referring to is part of the scariness that makes it worth doing for me. And also it's a way to see new things, especially technological things, on its own terms. Like in the current moment, like I just released an NFT project, and I had a lot of thoughts about NFTs before I started working on it, but I realized they were all cartoonish thoughts. They were thoughts from the outside in. And once you're working on it and working with other people who are working on it, you actually do see like what's good, what's bad, what's gray, and it's really impossible to know that in your body. You can just know things as cartoons from the outside in, like in your mind, but to know in your body, you kind of have to just do it. And so art for me is like a kind of a little space like for myself to like kind of do scary things.
Since you mentioned three-phase, I wonder if maybe we'll just skip briefly up to that, and then I'll come back to some other questions I had. So this is this project you just launched on the platform Outland, and it's an NFT. And the audience hasn't seen it. We're going to go back to diagrams and these drawings that are often part of your projects, because that seems really interesting to me. But like this diagram illustration, this depiction of the project, I mean, it feels so much to me like what we've been talking about with Bob, right? It's this idea of this emergent being. And in this case, it is just for the audience, basically when the collector mints this, they get the opportunity. Well, basically the NFT reads everything that is in the collector's wallet. And by reading all of the other NFTs, and maybe Ian, you can talk a little bit about what it's reading, it then starts to create a face of the collector based on the works that they have collected. And yeah, so there's a lot to go with there, but why don't you at least start by saying, like, what is it reading when it's reading? What else is in the wallet?
Yeah, so I mean, it came from this notion of like, I don't know if you ever go to a person's house and you just see their bookshelf and then you pass judgment, right? Like you see a person's bookshelf, you kind of have a sense of who they are. It might not be the full picture, of course, but it's not nothing. It's definitely a signal about who that person is, whether they're signaling that unconsciously or it's just something you happen upon. It does tell a story. You look at someone's taxes, it tells a story. Look at someone's credit card transactions, it tells a story. And I just thought, well, all the stuff on the blockchain, by its very nature, is public. That's the point of it. The addresses are anonymous, but the transactions are public. And I just thought it would be a fun way to really introduce psychological concepts that I'm myself obsessed and passionate about in this new way. So what it does, to be very brief, is that it looks at your wallet transaction history and it tries to make inferences about your personality traits, and then it produces this psychological portrait that's really roughly broken down into a little nature demon, a force of nature, a nurture demon that's kind of constricting, or maybe mediating is a better word, mediating the nature demon, and then a posture, which is the head at the top, which is how one is currently balancing their nature and nurture. Are they letting nature shine through? Are they letting it shine through too much and like totally monstrous? Or are they letting nurture overtake them and kind of purely living through obligation? In that case, they produce a resentful posture. Or is it something more balanced? Are they kind of content? Or are they kind of growing? And so I wanted to produce this stripped down psychological model, but have a fun way to have that reflect in a person's wallet. Again, these aren't necessarily my ideas, they're like psychological ideas that have existed for a while. I thought to put it in the context of Web3, of crypto, where people very much look at art and NFTs in Web3 as a form of expression, more than anything else, like the way that people, I don't know, buy skins in Fortnite to express themselves like kids, or the clothing that you buy are expressions of yourself. People in Web3 world see NFTs, one of the main utilities of it is an expression of yourself, whether that be your status, what exclusive club you're in, what your taste like, your sense of humor, your like, do you have kind of degenerate behavior? And I just thought everyone loves to express these things externally, but they also love to express their star sign, right? Like people love sharing what astrology sign they are. People love sharing their like Myers-Briggs type on the internet. And I think it's a way to kind of connect to someone in a way that's a little bit less superficial, and it's a bit of a matchmaking process where you can get at something specific about a person that you share too. Certainly that's my experience with astrology. I thought, oh, people like to express external things. They like to express internal things too about their psychology. Like, can we do that for Web3? Well, maybe this is like the first stab at that.
Can you describe just a little bit, because I've been intrigued, like what were the things that were like what about the public transaction did you identify as something to contribute to nature, to contribute to nurture? What were some of those, I guess, data points?
Sure. Yeah. Quite a range of things. We looked at everything from their willingness to spend gas, which is like the transaction fee, which fluctuates all the time. Some people are more willing to spend that than others, kind of indiscriminately. Some people are very careful about when they spend gas in order to make a transaction. Their NFT holdings, whether they have none, whether they have just blue chip stuff, whether they have a lot of indie projects, whether it's a mix, how long they've been holding those different statuses of projects. Says something about their conviction. Their interaction with decentralized exchanges, if they have a kind of DeFi mentality, that says something about them. Very basic things like their ETH balance and how much the balance is fluctuating, how active the wallet is. All these things were strong indicators when put into relief of what I call the delta, which is the change across different epochs of time in the wallet's history. So it's one thing to measure that at a given moment, but it's more meaningful to measure that in comparison to maybe the moment now versus the moment a week from now versus the moment 6 months from now versus a year ago. And then we could start to pull out stronger signals. And from that, yeah, the easiest thing to determine was their current posture. And again, this is like, it's more for fun. It's not like literally I don't want to say like I'm a therapist, like I've like somehow like automated therapy or anything. So it's nothing like that. But it is a little bit predictive of the kind of wallet that person has. Of course, there's this other issue that people in Web3 have more than one wallet. And so, they're divided amongst multiple kind of data streams, and no one data stream says everything about them. And so, of course, you can move your three-phase NFT to different wallets and then update it, and it can produce another psychological portrait of yourself from the perspective of that wallet. And I think the thing that people found engaging and fun is to move it across wallets to see what a certain wallet says about them, rather than what does three-phase definitively say about them in some absolute terms.
It seems really interesting too. I mean, I was intrigued by this project as soon as I heard about it. So it's sort of, but it's interesting. I mean, to your point, there is so much, especially online, because that's the whole thing, right? It's like there's avatars, there's like, what's the photo that you're posting of yourself? What's your background photo? Like all of there's so the semiotics of the online space are enormous. And which is a meaning making category. So but it's also interesting because like then that kind of distance on it, right? Like having it be suddenly externalized through this, through this imagery of the three-phase, somehow also allows for some kind of reflection back. And I think one of the things that was striking to me about it is that though maybe like discovering that you are like a mean parental figure, like you constantly send Bob like lying messages or like mean messages or something, could say something to you about yourself. The Bob project overall is really more about like observing Bob, whereas it's interesting how three-phase is asking sort of viewers and audience to reflect on themselves and to think about, even if it's not I don't have one, right? But like, even in looking at the ones that I've been able to see online, it's asked me to think about myself in that way in other types of situations, like the bookshelf or something, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, can you trace at all what maybe made that switch where you wanted people to be thinking about themselves a little bit more?
Yeah, totally. So I became obsessed with this idea that what if art could adapt to you, the viewer? I thought, oh, this would be an interesting pathway for art to go down. There'll always be all kinds of art, but what if there's a branch of art that really like adapted to you, the viewer, and not fully submit itself? Like it's not just subordinated to you entirely, but it's sort of like when you're a little kid and you're like role playing, I don't know, like I would play like pretend Star Wars with like my friends when I was a little kid, and Star Wars was enough of a rich framework. So like I could be, a Sith or a Jedi. There's enough roles that we were adapting to in this case, like the Star Wars IP, the world of Star Wars. But of course, we're interfacing our own personality, like, oh, you're the lazy, like I was saying to my friend, like you're the lazy Jedi. Like we had to find a Jedi that was lazy, because they're quite industrious as they're characterized, but yeah, sure enough, like you could find some lazy Jedi. And so you would adapt the person to this world, and this in-between space allowed both to shine through even more, both the fictional world, the artwork, and some aspects of a person's personality had a kind of license or permission to, when you role play, to kind of be free a little bit. This is kind of improv principle where you put on a mask, some part of your id is like free to come through that mask as full permission. And so I just thought, oh, if we could, what if art could like adapt itself to you more? And this became kind of an obsession in Three Face. But I can also imagine, there's an end game for Bob where this AI creature learns more and more about you as the viewer, a particular viewer, like you, like Charlotte, and you personally own a Bob. And I'm speculating in the future, and it learns enough about you that it can start to, in a way, do part of your life for you. Like maybe it can answer like trivial emails for you. Maybe you can send like little niceties for you. Maybe you can full on do the scripted thing that you do to certain people. I don't know, maybe you have a little script for your mom she asks you the same tedious question every like time. And then you can just kind of have I'm just making this up, like your AI Bob, like perform that for you on FaceTime. You can be in multiple places at once. You can be more than just yourself. I kept thinking, yeah, if art could adapt to you, there's something there. I don't have the answers. I just think this is kind of interesting. And I thought maybe this is where art could be going, given all the technological possibilities that are available to us now.
Yeah, that on some level that's already happening, right? We have these autocompletes that learn from the way we're already writing. And we have, there's on some level, these AIs are, very low level, like not at the level that you're describing, right? But this notion that that's something that could happen is definitely out there. And I think it's one of the things that appeals for developers around AI is this notion, like there seems to be a product there potentially, right? Like to not have to answer annoying questions. But the converse of it, and I think this is one of the reasons where people get, quite honestly scared of AI or actually reject it, is that it feels, I don't like the word wrong, but like it feels somehow wrong. Like there's something about having to take out the trash or having to do the annoying things, the difficult things, no matter how familiar they are, right? And like, even though Bob is constantly trying to turn unfamiliar things into familiar things, there's something about those annoying familiar things that feels rudimentary to life, that feels somehow significant to what it means to, if you'll forgive me, like to not be an asshole, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I think one of the anxieties around AI is that if AI can take care of all the mundane things, then you actually just become this kind of privileged twit. And so
if you stop growing.
Okay, so
yeah.
How so is it possible to keep, and I mean, I realize, like, I'll come back to the art, I promise, in just a moment, but like, is it possible to keep growing without having to do things like take out the trash or do those mundane, annoying things?
I mean, this was definitely a question I had in Making Life After Bob, the story, because Jalis, she outsources all of it to Bob, and she ends up having to inherit Bob's life experience as her own life. She's an inheritance kid, but not of wealth, but of life experience, which becomes a huge problem for her in the back half of the film, the episode, when she's like 20 years old and her ages 10 to 20 is all Bob's life experience. Basically, Bob was her, and she just is sitting outside of that and has heard about it, but didn't experience it. So it's not really hers to claim, and she doesn't know what the things really in a sensual way feel like. And so this is a big problem. But maybe the argument I had in my head at the time was, well, we outsource breathing. Like, imagine if you had to think about every breath of your day. Oh my God, how tedious would that be? I mean, you probably have problems breathing if you had to consciously think about breathing. And then you can just kind of push that limit further and further up the kind of limbic chain of your brain. Like, oh, we outsource brushing our teeth. I don't know about you, when I drive, like I'm pretty much outsourcing driving unless there's something really anomalous that comes in my way. I mean, I'm listening to a podcast, I'm talking to my wife, I'm paying attention to my kids, and I'm also able to kind of drive in this outsourced way. There's some driver demon inside of me that just knows what to do 90% of the time. And so I guess my feeling about AI technology and how it encroaches on our definition of human being, it boils down to me, this is amazing Douglas Adams quote. He's the guy who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He said, every technology that you come of age with when you're born is like nature to you. And then every technology that emerges from ages like 15 to 35, that's something you can make a career out of. And every technology that emerges after age 35 is like the end of the world and the total apocalypse, and humanity is doomed. And I think there is a natural, how do I say, aversion that as we all age, new things, I wouldn't just say technology, just new things become, they just don't get past the filter of like, oh, that's interesting. I think maybe we've seen too much of things go wrong, or our own beliefs are too incongruent with the new thing. Or we feel very mortal. We don't think we have the confidence that we have enough lifetime to see this new thing come to fruition. Imagine being the first people to see a motion picture camera and seeing the shitty movies that got made with the first camera. You couldn't call them movies. Movies was like a huge innovation. It's like the footage that got shot, like painters at the time would be like, when the camera first invented, like, oh, you're stealing my job, and it's like really bad. Like the lighting is horrible. 100, 200 years from now, like what a complex art form. So I think I always have to like pinch the part of me that is getting older to say like, oh, if I can talk to the child version of me, like, and what would it say if it was open to the new thing on its own terms? It would probably, if I was like my daughter's age, I'd be really, really curious and excited about the world.
It's nice to hear you put it that way, because I always remind people that in the history of literature, and it was one of the things that I got to study, when novels first came out, they were considered terrible. It was this terrible thing. People got lost in them. They were immersed in novels, and how they became antisocial. They didn't pay attention to conversation that was happening, right? And so novels, and I literally, like, I mean, those early novels were considered this really problematic medium, and an intelligent person should not read novels because it was bad for you, it's bad for your thinking. It was, so it's even like with like that's true with technology, what you're describing, and the Douglas Adams things is so great, but like it's true of technology, but it's true of media, right? Like when a new medium form emerges, there's always this kind of negative reaction to it, precisely because of what it does on some level, which then becomes this really appealing thing. And it seems as if with AI, part of it is trying to figure out, opportunities to experience it, right? Like I think that's one of the things that your work tries to do, is just to give audiences an opportunity to observe the functionality of AI in a context that doesn't seem dystopic, right? That isn't about like the AI is going to come and, ruin your life or something, right? But at the same time, also asks us to think about it. Bob is basically a kind of super ego, if you will, for Therese. And so, sure, that's not great either. If you put it in the context of a super ego as opposed to AI, right? Like there's these ways of the framework.
That's a really good analogy. Bob does act as a super ego, and as with our own super ego, Chalice, the main character, she, not to spoil anything, but she has to learn what parts of Bob to keep and what parts to discard, what parts of that super ego scaffolding that was really essential to her upbringing are still necessary in her adult life. She has to make that update, and that's a really painful one.
And I think one of the things that's, difficult about the AI moment that we're in is that it's not just going in the computer direction, but with more and more knowledge from the biological sciences, we've really had to confront like, well, animals aren't as stupid as we think they are. Like they actually have intelligence traits that are on a scale in relationship to ours, like bees, right? And elephants, like, have like are sentient beings in a way that is quite similar in any descriptive term to what we mean in terms of humans. And so it becomes like the status of sentience becomes really is as complicated right now as like the status of intelligence, because in fact those two things are really are no longer so easily kept apart. Like it's not just intelligence as this feeling experience that becomes really important. The Yurok tribe in Northern California gave personhood to the Klamath River. And they did that, and this is the sort of movement that's happening around the world with various different peoples, where they're recognizing, forms of life as legal persons that had never been considered that before. And one of the ways, it was this beautiful phrase that the tribe said is, for those who live on the Klamath River, its health reflects the people. The health of the river is the health of the people, right? And so that there's this sort of symbiotic relationship that becomes really important. And many environmentalists would argue that we should recognize greater sentience. We might all be living on a healthier, better planet. But anyway, so I feel like part of the challenge we're facing and that AI kind of represents is actually this sort of terrifying moment of recognizing just a wider span of sentience and being aboard. Yeah.
Definitely. I think I mean, if I put myself in the perspective of my child, like my kids, I think they would probably think it's really exciting. I mean, I imagine anyone older than 30, including myself, things like fake news is like, I feel victimized by fake news. But anyone younger than 30, they just smell that stuff from a mile away. And like, I know my kids, like, it's just part of the world, and they can make distinctions, what's what, much more easily in a way, because they've always lived with it. I think so. Like the alarm factor is different for different generations.
Totally. I wanted to just talk a little bit about these illustrations and diagrams, because there's so much a part of every project, it seems like. So there's this one that we were just looking at in the guide to worldling. You have a bunch of different sort of diagrams where you're trying to explain these different masks, as you put them, which also totally relates to three-phase. There was the one that we were looking at earlier. If you could go back to that sort of page of drawings of Bob. Yeah, that one. There's this, right? Like the illustration, and there's even more diagrams. I couldn't even get a chance to pull them, but like it feels like that's a huge part of all these projects. And I was just wondering if you could talk about like when they come and how they come, this sort of.
It's my way of thinking. I mean, it's especially those 2x2s, they're for me a really easy way. Every time I encounter like, I don't know, like a political subject matter or just a thing in the world where there's just a binary choice, I'm like, you just throw one more axis on it, like you get a much more nuanced perspective, and it just takes one more dimension, let alone the actual like multidimensionality of most complex things that we have to grapple with in our lifetime. And so I just think, it always gives me perspective. I throw one more axis on a binary thing, and it becomes I have more perspective and a little more actual empathy for all the positions that live on the map. And I often try to, selfishly try to find myself within that. Am I really like just this one thing? Or maybe I'm moving around, like, I mean, in this very basic two-dimensional model, like maybe like, my mind is moving around into these different quadrants. Well, that feels a lot better than just being casted onto one axis and saying you're like, left, right, or center. And so for me, it's a way of thinking with a little more empathy toward the truth, I guess. And another way is, I work more and more with my producer, Veronica So, and we work with a team of people, and especially these more complex projects. A lot of that stuff needs to be explained. And honestly, typing stuff is not only not fun, but actually not that explanatory. Often like drawing goes a million more miles to explaining what's in my head or what direction I'm thinking of. And it could be wrong, but it's much faster and it's much richer as a kind of communication tool. So I draw a lot as a way to suss out an idea with my team or to explain like a direction that I'm thinking of, but it takes quite a long time to actually make the final artwork. So like, here's a drawing, like now we have a little North Star to aim at. And maybe Ian changes his mind again and changes the North Star, but at least it's a concrete thing if it's a drawing. When it's just words, a text message, a Slack message, or an email, like man, I don't know about you, but it's word salad. You don't really get the message.
But also, I mean, I want to go back to the drawings, but like also even software engineers are constantly drawing diagrams, right? Like that's how they try and communicate flows and like action. Like I'm always sort of intrigued by all the different diagrams that are actually a part of any software process.
I love Tibetan tankas. My in-laws they're pretty serious Tibetan Buddhists. I asked them like, oh, like they have all these tankas in the house. I'm like, oh, what are these? Like, they're very beautiful. And my father-in-law, John, was like, well, they're not just beautiful paintings. That they are very skilled. They're maps. They're maps of knowledge, and they're an aid to, in the case of these tankas, meditation. When when he's meditating, and he's not like just trying to make his mind blank, he's kind of more Zen or Western idea of meditation. He's trying to move through. He's almost like painting in VR. He's like painting all, like, for example, like he told me once, he had to imagine, one exercise was to imagine all the female figures in his life going back from his mom to his grandma, all the way back to as far as he can remember, all back to as far as he can imagine. And then he had to think of all the male figures in his life, from his father to his grandfather to all the males going back as far as he can imagine. And then the tanka represents some of that and became a kind of aid to recenter him, like where on the map that he had to fill in the paint where. And the trippy thing is like once you fill in all the paint on one level, then you zoom into like, this one tiny part, and within that there's a whole other universe and world to then paint out. And you can therefore meditate for hours on end. And so for me, like a drawing is more than just like a drawing. It's like a kind of a map of knowledge. Of course, I'm drawing this in the moment for the nature of the project, and so it's a map of very provisional knowledge, but some of it sticks around, and I try to formalize and concretize those.
So do you carry around a sketchbook, or like, do you draw regularly? I made me think of it just because here, like there's all these different colors, and it felt like I could imagine you at a desk with like different colored pens that you use specifically for this part of the practice. Is it really like a common, is it an everyday part of your life, or?
It ebbs and wanes. Like, when you see the different colors, that's probably a different day that I just pick up a pen that's available, and I just start like working things out in whatever space is available. And so probably the colors here, these are different days of me working on the same piece of paper, being too lazy to like bring out a new piece of paper. But I work that way often. And the other thing I do is this writing exercise called morning pages. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. Like it's a way of like just like flushing out all your anxieties. So it's essentially I type it, but you're supposed to write longhand, like 3 pages of uninterrupted just writing. You make
How do you do that?
Thoughts come out, you just put it on the page, and then the anxieties live on the page. And what's transformative about it is often those anxieties, if you do in the morning, turn into ideas or even sometimes solutions. And so for me, it's been very curative to just, people call it journaling. I do that a lot too.
But how do you do that with children? Like one of the questions people often have with morning pages is like, I mean, you wake up first thing in the morning, you've got kids, they need apple juice, or maybe not apple juice.
As soon as the babysitter gets there.
Yeah.
yeah. Or more and more, I've been learning to wake up earlier before the kids wake up.
Okay.
So yeah, no, it's for sure a challenge.
Just because you're in Berlin, one of the last questions I wanted to ask before I open it up to the audience is just, have you found different reactions to Life After Bob or the Bob project overall in different places around the world?
Life After Bob really worked in Korea. I had opened a show in Seoul at the Lian Museum, and for some reason, it really was resonant there. I mean, I can only speculate. My speculation is that, well, Korea wants to see itself, Korea wants to see itself as like kind of the new entertainment capital of the world, the new production studio of the world. So obviously like animation, narrative filmmaking, it's very strong in Korea. There's obviously a great love and appreciation and thirst for art. So there's that, but then there's also a lot of psychological stuff that is want to explore. Like every Korean movie you see, of course, there's a parent drama at the heart of it. I mean, it might be a sci-fi thing, but it's a parent drama. It might be a horror vampire thing, but it's a parent drama. And I think the relationship between parents and children in Korea is quite complicated and also quite strong. And often, from what I learned when I was there, it's very hierarchical and loyalty driven. Like you almost like go out to the world as an avatar to be your best so that you can bring the best back for your parents or for the family, almost dynastic in a way. And so I think Life After Bob, because it is a father-daughter story at the heart of it, combined with it being animated, it's made in a video game engine, looks like anime. I think it had, I'd like to think it had some double meaning for people who saw it there.
That's really great. Well, I mean, I have more questions, and I there's tons of things I wanted to ask you about. I mentioned at the beginning how I overthink everything, but I want to open it up to the audience to see if other people would like to ask questions. So I will quiet myself now unless I get to ask more.
Yeah, so we'll start. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that amazing conversation into your work, Ian. That was really, really special and great.
Sure. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. Thank you, Charlotte, as well. We do have a first question from our friend GE. So GE, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you, Charlotte and Ian. Can you talk a bit about how art can be kind of like a lens in which we might find new formats to fully appreciate things like emergence? And I'm thinking of emergence that might occur in individuals, in society, and perhaps even creatures in nature, cicadas, that kind of thing. I mean, no.
Sure. I mean, when I was a kid, I was really in love with these video games made by a guy called Will Wright, and he did this like game SimCity and The Sims. And what's so cool about those games is you're not in the point of view, you're not like a first person point of view, and you don't even have an avatar, you're not like a character. You're in SimCity, you're like an abstract, I guess, mayor of a city, but you're dealing with like zoning laws and like plumbing and electricity and emergent behavior that happens. And somehow he made me as a kid fall in love with systems, which is like a really unsexy thing to fall in love with, but somehow through the aesthetics, the way the game was set up, just the design of the game, he made me fall in love with that stuff. And that always stuck with me. Like, oh, he managed to seduce me and among many other people to fall in love with like social systems with the Sims, like city systems with SimCity. Maybe, maybe I can do that with my own art. So he, for me, is a huge inspiration. And certainly I think one of art's jobs is to put people in touch with things that are transcendent. And by that, I don't mean holy necessarily, or it can be that, but transcendent means like something that is bigger and probably more complex than you and beyond you. And that includes complex systems with emergent qualities that you can't fully predict. And I think when art can put you in touch with transcendent things using very concrete means, oh, it's a screen in front of you that you watch, or it's like a sculptural material, then it's a kind of magic that happens that you feel, for me, I feel more alive. I feel a little bit outside of myself. I also feel this thing about, I was talking about earlier, like I feel like a scary thing has been kind of unpacked for me with a guide in a way. The artwork is the kind of prosthetic guide that maybe it too, its author was equally scared, but did the work of being scared for you in one particular direction. And if you like that work or you resonate with it, it's like, oh, you enjoyed that guide's guide to this scary thing. And I think art can certainly do those things. I mean, obviously not all art does that, and not all artists have those aspirations, but I think that's one of maybe its completely universal and redemptive qualities, is it can put you in touch with the transcendent.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, GE. Our next question is going to come from Raven.
Hi. My question is, who are some artists and writers who have informed your work? And I'm particularly interested in if any children's books have been an inspiration in thinking about the parallels between AI and the kids that you've mentioned.
Oh, children's books. Well, I read a lot of children's books now because I have kids. And there's a book that there's two books. And this is going to be really stupid because they're children's books, but there's this guy called Richard Scarry. I don't know if he drew these like children's books with all these like little animals. And I realized my mom sent over a Richard Scarry book. I think it's called like Cars, Trucks, and Things That Go, or something like this. It's just a book of lots of different cars in traffic. And there's a little pig family that you follow. And I jogged all these memories from when I was a kid. My mom used to read that to me or show me that book all the time. And now I'm reading it to Eden. And I realized, oh, this is a little portal to a really complex world that Richard Scarry like geniusly makes you fall in love with. You follow this little pig family on a road trip and they run into all this traffic, but there's all these little subplots along the way. There's like a little hound dog in a sports car that's being chased by the police officer Flossie, this little fox, the whole way through. And if you notice it, if you want to notice it, there's this little subplot. And I realized this is a huge inspiration to me unconsciously for all the simulations that I made, where you're looking at a screen and there's little dramas happening, but you're also aware of the macro picture. And so you're not caught up in any one drama, but if you wanted to, you could follow that line. And when you look at a Richard Scarry book, there's like a macro picture of an ecosystem, these cute little animal characters living in society, doing pretty non-dramatic things. But if you want to focus on it, he creates little dramas in there for you. So that was a huge inspiration. And then just more recently, like I love this movie Turning Red. I don't know if you've seen this. It's like this girl who's like becoming a teenager and she turns into a red panda. And I just thought there's so much joy in the making of it. It's so joyful. The mom has this message at the end. It's sort of the moral of the movie where her mom's really attached to her as a tiger mom. And she says to her finally at the end, like, the farther you go, the prouder I'll be. And I don't know, I found that so moving as a parent. Because every parent wants to cling to your child, of course you want to protect them. And I think it takes almost like a divorce level amount of pain to say that to your child and be able to muster that notion to yourself. And whatever, Pixar captured that in, how many words is that? Like, the farther you go, the prouder I'll be. It's just so beautiful. So I think there's like really, really, really inspiring art out there. And it's right there on the surface. It's right there on Netflix or Disney Plus, and it's right there, you know? It's not that far away from any of us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Eleanor is going to ask the next question.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much. Awesome conversation. Thank you, Charlotte. My question is, has your work in like technology, AI, kind of these like, you know, non-tangible forms sometimes, has it changed kind of your relationship to like physical space, especially in the context of like an exhibit or a gallery? If you're doing install, like I know you're doing install right now, just like how has your work kind of changed your relationship with space?
You know, I mean, when I was first making work, like in my office, in my studio, obviously on screen, most of my work is digital work. I think I really underappreciated like physical experience. And then as soon as I started showing my work and starting to have to consider physical experience, I remember the very first show I did was through a friend who decided to quit being a painter and start a gallery in Miami. And he happened to have this really tall space in Miami. I remember, I made this like kind of motion capture animation thing. And it's like, how are we going to present it? And the convention at the time was just a projector, right? Like, no brainer. But I thought, like, wow, that's such a tall building. It's so weird to just project it. And so I was like, oh, his name is Clay. Clay, you have to build an 8 by 4 foot panel, and it has to lean. It's like the size of a giant iPhone. This is in 2011. And then we have to project on that, and then it will have this presence in the room. And this was all kind of, I was learning as I was doing. And ever since that moment, I mean, that's been a convention I've used a lot now. Like, we're not projecting on the wall because it feels very flimsy, but you project on like a surface, and then that feels like it has some muscle and presence to it. I've learned that, you're a body when you look at an exhibition, first and foremost. And when a show, you enter an exhibitions you really like remember, like they talk to your body first, I think. Now I have this belief now. They talk to your body first, and then they talk to your mind. But to talk to your body, I mean, that's one of the maybe the joys of doing exhibitions is like, well, you have a canvas to talk to people's bodies that you can't do with digital art. You're talking to other things, or maybe you're talking to the world like symbols and style digitally, but to talk to a body, you have to be physically present, and you have to activate all those things that aren't just your eyes when you go see an exhibition. And so now it's like one of my main values when I'm making artwork, when I make an exhibition, is like I say I have to talk to a person's unconscious, and I have to talk to a person's body. If I'm not doing those things, I'm not really doing my job. And it might be a free ticket, but you're not getting your money's worth. And so I feel obligated to do those things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. And thank you, Ian, for those answers. I'll ask the last question. I've really liked the thread across the conversation about life after, life after the novel, life after Bob, Chalice sort of discovering that she has to kind of take ownership of what Bob has been doing. And I wonder what your life is like after Bob. And also like what is your life after Bob, but also how has working with Bob and seeing Bob evolve sort of shaped how you look ahead in your work and shaped how you're planning ahead for future projects as well?
It makes me want to make a lot more virtual creatures that interact with each other, as Charlotte was pointing out. Definitely want to do that. I want to make a world of my own Pokemon in a way, not so to speak. There's that. I definitely want to make art that adapts more to you, like this idea of like a mirror you. This is definitely something that I'm super excited by. Imagine being able to communicate with your great grandma, and you knew that the thing you were communicating with, of course, is a technology and maybe it's an artwork, but it had the style thinking of your great grandma. You would feel like you're looking at more than just pictures of your grandma. Like you could find a way to know your grandma in these other ways. It's not your grandma. We're not trying to produce a simulation of your grandma, but to reproduce a style of thought is to me like a richer way of knowing yourself, knowing, again, this transcendent thing, which is generations that came before you, what could have been. A person isn't just the facts of their life, it's all their potentiality. It's the style of their thinking and being that could have led to other things given other very simple circumstances. And that perhaps is maybe the essence of a person. And if you could capture a little bit of that, there's great utility in that. I think it's very edifying for oneself and also for future generations. And so I'm very excited about this idea of like being able to create an AI that could mimic a style of thought as a way to have a richer appreciative way of engaging with the past and the future.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for this amazing conversation today. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Ian.
Great questions. My pleasure.
At The Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today it's my absolute pleasure to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Dot Devota. Dot Devota writes poems and essays about pre-sickness, sensations in the phenomenon of falling ill, and post-viral, chronic, and mysterious illness in individual, societal, and environmental bodyscapes. Her books include PMS, A Journal in Verse, and The Division of Labor, and The Girls Worried Terribly, The Eternal Wall, and Department of Posthumous Letters. Excerpts from her nonfiction novel, M.W., A Field Guide to the Midwest, are published in PEN America and Denver Quarterly, among others. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dot.
Hi, thank you, Ian and Charlotte, for just modeling such a brilliant level of curiosity. I appreciate all these many topics of writer's block and dads and lying and social isolation, the mind. I appreciate artist masks so incredibly much. And also this pivot to talking to the body. So I'm going to read a poem that comes from, it's an excerpt from a book called The Architecture of Writing, and it's spelled architecture. And it talks about, the architecture of writing, the constructs that create disability, and how writing is taught and gets reproduced and reconstructed that creates these inequities and disabilities. So talking to the body very much. And also your question, Ian, what if art could adapt itself to you? It's going to haunt me tonight in a good way. All right. So thanks again to the Brooklyn Rail and everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for also including my dreamlike approach to this discussion. The architecture of writing. I'm disabled by the architecture of writing. We usually think of it as architecture, the construction of buildings under the Coda of National Infrastructure and a society, just going to and at work. One then is excluded from writing and relocated. Writing is a technological construct. Here we are, all on our Mac computers, before it was typewriters, and before even pen and paper. You know, it's this building with an entrance narrow and too short. You bow to the architect, you get vertigo, you have only a voice, you get humanized. Not just how someone feels in this architecture, but how the meaning of feeling drives behavior. Environmental psychology, you know, environs are mental, and socio-architecture, building together whatness. Why the first impulse to have the hand write? Oral traditions, vulnerable, and they spell a story, and the tool, I mean, even visions on rock, a building, a domestic and public canvas. Above firelight, and then the letters in one language gets formalized and registered. And so too was our way of disconstructing the communication. The human mind wants and needs and feels compelled, right, even to say mind, you know, in the same way you feel you need a hug. There are people who feel born to write, and perhaps over time their abilities stratify, and the ways in which writing happens suddenly unhappens. The architecture, environments in which you learned to write. There were desks and chairs and this hard seating, this proliferation of fluorescent lights, apartheid St. Louis, and the teacher stepped out and children ran to the wall, of windows that don't open and they weren't allowed to open, or thrown open by Luana and accidentally onto your head. And she walked you to the nurse, holding your hand, her arm around your shoulder. The institutional windows, they weighed so much and were so heavy, one had to pull hard. Falling down is how they opened. Luana saw a clearing and it had a handle and she wanted us to breathe. Yes, go back to the very foundation, the children who were the first activists. That scar on your eyebrow, it's an architecture also. One, the lexicon. Two, generating, drafting, revision, editing. Does your writing about disability itself pass as non-disabled? To reconvene a different body on paper. Is the paper an assistive technology? To pass off the easy missteps of grammar. It is natural to misspell. Misspelling is artisan and innate in writing and language and speaking, as is slurring words and stuttering. And yet to create from this a trap, committing a grammatical mistake. And when you are deemed old enough to know better. So how easy and swift to take down. In your early 30s, you applied for a grant that asked for a draft, a work in progress. And in the first line, you mistook past for past. You said, my father passed on. And the sculptor on the panel, he yelled, the horror of her grammar. But you heard instead the horror of her grammar. The real grammatical error was that you lied and your father did not pass on in the Midwest in the 90s. He was kept inside the closet. And when he ventured slightly out, encountered the HIV/AIDS pandemic, was then forced to widen the closet, drinking and slurring his speech, they ran him out of breath. The architecture, the implicit and hidden curriculum, a deliberate archy, an arc ascending and then descending, and one hell being a bell curve. Some might say the writer is a personal, and that personals are housed with ego, since the person with a social security is considered terra firma, and the person with a soul is consciousness and alchemical. so that the persona, that part of the person who writes and needs clarity, is an architecture of one nowhere needing shelter. Whereas the words turn to the persona and say, she thought you were the shelter. The architecture, the pens, the black ink, the blue ink, the writing instrument, it all had to be exact. And your writing would not be counted. It could not be read by machines or post offices or the government agencies checking off boxes in your wake. The cursive you suddenly had to switch to. Your father commented how nice it was, this penmanship of running. Your father, as a lefty, he architectured a wherewithal of knowing later. He had been deemed a nuisance by every teacher, desk, appliance. The devil is left-handed, the Latin word meaning sinister, and the French word meaning clumsy. He knew French, and his name tripped the borders, chou and maillet. He taught you 1 second of French before your mother, first generation to college and lucky to get off the farm, aware of these patterns of potential. She stopped it for fear it would affect your English. Ouvre la porte. He taught you to say in that split second, open the door. And as soon as he taught you that, the next flashcard appeared in the architecture of chance. No touche pas. Thank you all.
Wow, thank you so much, Dot. That was amazing. Thank you very, very much for that reading. That was incredible. And thank you again to Ian and to Charlotte for today's conversation. We, of course, would also like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events like here on our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. We wish those of you who are in the US a safe and relaxing holiday weekend. And if you're looking for something to tune into Monday, we won't be here live, but we'll be posting a special recording of Richard Jackson in conversation with Jeffrey Grenthaner from Hauser and Wirth in Zurich. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Dot. Great
Thank
poem.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dot,
you.
Ian,
Thank you.
Charlotte.
Thank you
Molly.
so much.
Thank you.
Over at the show.
Thank you.